Hi, everyone. My name is Carl Bystram. Welcome back to Metropolis. Today is February 28th, 2024.
Amazing.
Amazing. So far, would you say this is an amazing year?
Yeah, it's been an interesting year, I think.
Interesting.
The weather definitely interesting.
Yeah, it is late February and it is 14 degrees today.
Yeah, it feels a bit unreal.
Yeah, it's like kind of nice, but then I'm like, this is
Unsettling.
concerning. Yes,
Yeah.
unsettling. Should not be this nice. Anyways, we're not talking about the weather today. Today we have our guest, Carl Bystram.
Yes.
Am I saying that right? Bystram?
No, it's okay. It's Carl Bystram.
Bystram.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for that correction. Carl is a community researcher, support worker, and organizer based in Montreal.
Yeah.
Carl, what are we going to be talking about today?
So I had kind of pitched the idea of talking about the state of trans healthcare in Quebec, and also maybe a bit more broadly in Canada, and maybe the state of trans rights as well. These are kind of issues that bleed into each other.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. Let's go to our first slide. This is an article Carl wrote in Canadian Dimension. When was that? Last year, March 6th.
Yeah.
So some of the stats and surveys you kind of base this article off of, you say are a little, perhaps not quite outdated, but like a new one could be.
It could definitely be conducted. So this has come, a lot of the stats that I published in that article are coming from the Being Safe, Being Me survey in 2019. So 2019, not that long ago, but obviously like with the pandemic being kind of an intervening force, and as well as like some kind of like important changes to hospital systems, the healthcare system, and like also all types of kind of like social backlash that have happened since then. I think it would be interesting to see a survey conducted in 2024 if they would come to similar findings. But yeah, the Being Safe, Being Me survey was a comprehensive survey of trans youth in Canada, and it was looking at kind of like different institutional realities that they faced, including like kind of like the realities in healthcare systems and in school systems, as well as like their mental health generally, and their access to kind of like gender affirming resources. So it's actually a very interesting resource, and I would really encourage people to look at it because I think it can really give you kind of like a more holistic kind of portrayal that is like data and reality based on trans youth, and get you maybe a little bit away from extremely polarized discourse.
Of course. What I really enjoy about this article and the kind of sources you use, it kind of pulls people out of like what they think the issue is, right? What their kind of imagination of the issue is. I think I pulled some stuff from the article here. It's this kind of I found this was like a really I guess concerning, alarming statistics that really kind of illuminate the issue. The Being Safe, Being Me survey on trans youth health, conducted by University of British Columbia in 2019, concluded that almost 2/3 of trans and or non-binary youth have self-harmed, 64%, and or seriously considered suicide, 64% within the past year. Of these youth, 63% reported severe emotional distress and 21% attempted suicide. The other statistics reported in the survey shed light on strong environmental factors, like you were saying, contributing to poor mental health. Trans youth report feeling unsafe in their homes, experiencing higher rates of domestic and sexual violence, and contending with discrimination in various public locations, as well as in school and in the healthcare system. As these youth were confined to threatening domestic spheres and further isolated from their communities during the pandemic lockdowns, it is likely that these health effects and outcomes have worsened considerably since the pre-pandemic period. It's
Yeah, it was a pretty, and I mean, I wrote this article and it was mainly about basically the public and private interactions of the healthcare system on trans healthcare. I will say also on the survey, the other aspect that I think is quite relevant to point out is that like one of the main things that alleviated the like bad mental health outcomes for trans youth was access to transition and access to kind of like gender affirming healthcare. So it really does sometimes when you encounter a very kind of right wing discourse against trans people, it basically portrays trans people as coming in as delusional, coming in as kind of mentally ill. And then so whenever you can tell them the statistics about how poorly trans youth are doing, they're like, well, that's not surprising, or that doesn't prove anything, because they have kind of inverted the causality.
Right.
And what you can see really clearly in this survey is that like it is very clear that like again, gender affirming care does actually improve mental health outcomes. It improves physical health outcomes. In every way, it seems like there is extremely strong evidence that access to proper healthcare, access to kind of like affirmation amongst peer networks, all of these things will improve health, like mental and physical health outcomes for trans youth.
Of course, yeah, we have here those. This is from the survey. Those who lived in their felt gender all the time were almost 50% more likely to report good or excellent mental health. So that kind of ties into that immediately, right?
Yeah, exactly.
So I'm kind of curious about. So this is you wrote this just last year. This survey is from 2019. If you had to give like a broad assessment of trans health now in Montreal, in Canada, what were some? How would you assess it right now?
Well, I would say like in terms of, again, I wrote this last year, so like in terms of like large scale kind of like development, it's hard to say like maybe I haven't had the time to conclude a wide sweeping assessment of healthcare, but I can say like what's been in the news lately has been quite concerning in terms of like this month we saw that Alberta was like passing all of these pretty extreme anti-trans laws, and they were actually doing things that kind of like directly are really high causes of concern when you look at the results of like the survey on trans youth that I was talking about, like in terms of like causing there to be kind of mandatory alerts to parents if children or like youth in schools were asking to be called a different pronoun or a different name, that this would be reported to parents who might not be accepting automatically. So like potentially creating these like really hostile environments, further restricting access to kind of like gender affirming kind of surgeries or treatments for youth, and also like generally I will say like it's pretty clear from the Premier's discourse that she is participating in some a lot of misinformation about trans people.
She being the Premier of Alberta.
Yes. She actually had like a pretty. When I watched kind of clips about her interviews, kind of defending her position, she actually did mention that like her position was more based on what she thought could happen,
right, rather
than on a kind of like expansive kind of like survey of what was happening to trans youth. One of the other things was just like banning kind of like top surgery for youth, and I think the numbers was about like of surgery. Of top surgery that was related to gender affirmation or gender dysphoria for teenagers in Canada of that year, there were like, I think 8. You know, it's like not exactly an epidemic.
8? That's just one single digit 8?
Yeah, that's a single digit 8, right?
Gotcha.
And I mean, you know, there might be, it could be that some surgeons didn't keep like exact numbers or didn't keep numbers on like the origin. But in any case, it's hard to imagine that we're looking at an epidemic. You know, if I think that would be the wrong framing as well. But like that the numbers aren't exceptionally high in terms of like youth getting top surgery. What
do you? Yeah. I just want to ask, like, the Conservatives kind of make this big cultural issue, this big kind of like issue to like kind of dig their heels in. What do you think it is about trans youth and like gender identity that kind of irks all of these conservatives?
I think there's a lot of things. Like, I think one of the things is that it's quite easy to sensationalize pretty much a lot of things related to gender affirming care for trans people, because on the one hand, trans people are a sliver of society, right? Like it's quite a small proportion of society. A lot of trans people lived in closeted or, you know, wouldn't openly announce themselves to be trans in society. So it can lead, you know, like 50-year-olds or whatever to think that they've never met a trans person at all, right? Like even if they might have and just didn't know about it. And then like I think that's kind of like one element, that it's a very small minority of people. It's easier to scapegoat. You can see maybe there being kind of a direct line between the treatment of gay and lesbian people to trans people. That there's a lot of like kind of stereotypes around that are kind of like being used and abused in this case. There's maybe a religious element for like kind of Christian conservatives, where there's like, you know, when there was like the previous kind of like, oh, I'm gonna quote Leviticus against gay people. Now there's like, oh, Adam and Eve, you know. So that can be kind of an element of it as well. I think on top of it, there's anxieties about the patriarchal family, anxieties about like gender identity more broadly. I think there's like another element that can be also kind of related to the former kind of sex ed panics. I see a lot of parallels between the type of conservative movements that wanted to ban sexual education in school and education about gender identity in school. I think there's similar tactics, there's similar rhetoric, similar strategy. So I would say all of these things are like that there can be kind of like a reuse of discourse, basically, that things can kind of get recycled, and that also the community that is kind of like aimed at is quite small and misunderstood. I think are all kind of contributing factors.
That leads us to that. No, yeah, that's really interesting. I think something I think of when I think of this kind of like panic over like any kind of like sexual education or like gender education in schools was the protest back in, I think it was October. I think we have some coverage of it that we did. It was the Million March for Families or
for children,
for children or something like that. And I think there's an interesting rhetoric being used by the people who are organizing this march. And this march was like, it was kind of like all across Canada. I don't know if it ended up being millions, but at least the Montreal contingent here was like maybe a few hundred. I think there's this really interesting line that the Million Marchers were using when they were talking about the children belong to the parents, right? And so they saw this kind of gender education, sexual education in school as something that's sort of like impeding that parental authority.
I agree. Like I think there were like big posters at that march that said like that kind of children belong to their parents. I think I remember that being an element. Yes.
I thought that was one of the most kind of concerning, interesting things about this kind of movement, and that they saw that like any kind of like education in school. Which there's also signs about educate like what they want their children to learn in school. They had some kids who had signs that said, "I go to school for like to learn about math, science, language, but not about gender," you know. And it's interesting seeing that kind of like distinction drawn, or seeing this kind of issue being brought up with this kind of wider exploration of gender, which for like some parents are like, that's supposed to be off the books. I'm sending my kids to school just so they can become like whatever, like good engineers. They don't need to learn about this gender nonsense. And so a result of these protests was the if we're going back to Quebec now, Quebec created a gender committee. I believe, what were they called again?
Comité des Sages.
The Comité des Sages, yeah. So if we go to our next slide, we have here, so Quebec Gender Identity Committee lacks transgender representation. So, I mean, just even before we get into that, so this committee was kind of made in, was it like last year? And they've sort of been tasked with, addressing this kind of the whole idea behind it was that this came in response to these kinds of demonstrations being held across Canada, some in Quebec as well, about gender education, gender identity politics, I guess, in schools. This article specifically is about this trans activist here based in Montreal, Celeste Trianon, who I have interviewed before and who's made comments for us. If we go to our next slide, you'll see here we go. There's not sharp words, I would say. So they think we're a community that needs to be put under some form of legal tutorship that is at least the basic gist. At the same time, it's also a lack of trust on the government and in the people who are most concerned by this. Trans people are currently facing unprecedented levels of discrimination in a long time. So I guess there's a lot to go off here, but what do you make of this Comité des Sages, this kind of committee? It's this 3-person committee that's been formed to kind of advise the government on gender issues.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think it's an interesting move. I will say, so across Canada, we are seeing like in Alberta and in New Brunswick, there's been like a raft of like very anti-trans laws that have been passed, and in Quebec, we had kind of like maybe a related attempt to kind of like further legislate trans identity, which was like Bill 2, which was kind of like the past couple of years as well, and that did not pass. And there's been kind of like, but there has been some back and forth with the government on X markers on identity papers.
Driver's licenses, birth certificates.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And the government has kind of chosen to delay that till 2025 to kind of implement this kind of bureaucratic element. In some cases, so there is like an element where we are still seeing some kind of like effort to roll back trans rights in Quebec. I will say I do not think that it is the same kind of level that we're seeing in Alberta and New Brunswick, but I think it's still kind of a cause for concern. I will say the Comité de Sages, as far as I understand it, kind of a LGBT council kind of like disapproved a little bit, or was in conversation with the government about kind of like their disapproval of how they were constituting the committee. The fact that they're not including any trans representation or even any kind of expert on trans issues, I think is really a cause for concern.
Right. So the three people on the advisory committee are, hold on, let me. So I just had this on the paper. Yeah, I was looking at this before. You have one person who used to be in charge of the so Diane Navalet, former FIQ Nurses Union boss, Dr. Jean-Bernard Trudeau, former Deputy Director General of the Quebec College of Physicians, and Patrick Taillon, a professor of law. So none of these people are really specialized in this, and so it's kind of almost like an advisory committee of people who are not really experts on the issue.
Yeah, I mean, it's also, I think, beyond just the composition of the committee, there's also a little bit of the scope of the committee, because I think it would be helpful, at least in my opinion, if there's a little bit more clarity as to what the government was hoping to accomplish with this committee. Part of when you read about the kind of like justification or the scope of kind of like what they're supposed to do, it seems like they're supposed to review existing policies on trans people and review maybe like the social impact of these policies on kind of the wider Quebec society. And I would say that it feels like there's something quite missing, right? Which is to maybe think about the impact of these policies on trans people, right. Which should be at least as important a factor, in my opinion, as like the wider Quebec society. However, I will say like, I don't want to be an apologist for the committee. I think they are making a mistake. I will say that it is a little bit encouraging that at least the Quebec government is trusting doctors and nurses somewhat, is listening to some extent to the healthcare system, because while the healthcare system can be quite discriminatory against trans people, you will find that in Alberta, it's actually doctors who are writing these kind of like long petitions against the government to kind of like oppose the treatment of trans children, or like the ban on gender affirming care, right?
Those are that in Alberta is being headed by doctors.
Yeah, doctors are actually protesting against like the government's policies.
Towards
right? Okay. Sorry. Maybe I didn't word that very clearly.
No. You clarified it. Yeah. So doctors are leading the charge in forms of like some petitions in favor of surgeries for trans people.
Yeah, and it's not just surgeries. Actually, most of what the government is banning is stuff like puberty blockers or like reversible procedures, right? Which is also like again like the reversible, irreversible kind of framing of different procedures is a little bit, I think, not accurate. Like you will find that like I think Pierre Poilievre has been using the word irreversible a lot, or like adult decisions to talk about puberty blockers, which are reversible. Right. Puberty blockers delay the onset of puberty, which means that they are reversible.
I guess the idea behind it is just more to kind of make a big bogeyman out of this then.
Exactly. And it's also because there's like, there was a very popular book, for example, called Irreversible Damage, that was about the idea that like young girls were being mutilated by the trans agenda, right? Like, so there's a little bit of like that kind of framing. I think is basically a scare tactic. In the informed consent model that many doctors follow for trans therapies, they do tell you what changes you can expect, what changes are reversible and irreversible. These are kind of like things that are clarified for the people who are going through these procedures. So it's like there is a little bit of like, yeah, the rhetoric that people like Pierre Poilievre have is like very, very paternalistic in that sense.
Of course, yeah.
Yeah, sorry, I've gone a little bit further away from the.
That's right. No, this was a useful little tangent, talking about this kind of reversible, irreversible kind of rhetoric that's being deployed in this around this issue.
Yeah, like I think in the conservative imaginary, I think they think that 12-year-olds are getting like major surgery or things like that, which is just not the case.
Right.
Yeah.
I think so. Before we were talking about the doctors. You're saying it's kind of not great that like this committee, DESAGE, is not really doesn't have that kind of representation in their 3-person committee. But the fact that the government is trusting doctors and healthcare professionals is sort of a silver lining, I guess, of sorts.
In a way, just because we are seeing that like the medical consensus is that transition does help outcomes for trans youth. This is the scientific consensus. Right. Again, not every doctor, not whatever, but at the same time, you will find out like it's like actually the medical establishment that will come and intervene and say like, look, this is just not based in science. This is based in what is actually happening in hospitals, in clinics, in patients' rooms. This is based on what is happening in rhetoric, in the imaginary, so I think there is a sense of like, well, okay, looking at existing policy, reviewing existing policy, I can see at least that there is an attempt at reality-based policy,
sure,
which we are seeing a really broad detachment from, right? When we were looking at the laws that were in Alberta, the Alberta Premier brought up a video on YouTube that she'd watched where a transgender athlete allegedly dominated over these other cis athlete. And this video is misinformation. Like, right? She's quoting a very well-known video that circulated and that was actually a cisgender athlete who...
Oh.
Yes.
So it wasn't even...
they're fictions, right? Yeah. And they're fictions that I think are very compelling for certain types of people that might not have like a strong relationship to the trans community or even have like an understanding of basically what trans healthcare is.
I really like that bit about it being fiction and this premiere is kind of falling for it. It's like if Legault went to watch the Avengers and then afterwards like, guys, we need to do something about Thanos.
Yeah. Well, I mean, if you can think of like, a boomer on Facebook making policy based on like what they're reading on the news, it's pretty scary. You would like to get to a point where it's like policy is developed in its ability to kind of benefit people.
Right. Of course.
And I would like to see that trans policy is developed to benefit trans people and protect trans people's rights. I think this should be its major aim, right?
What are you expecting of this committee de Sage?
Well, I'm hoping that its purpose and is clarified. I'm hoping that the government hears the feedback and tries to include experts on transgender issues and especially trans people themselves that might reflect the broadness and diversity of trans experience are included on the committee. That there's maybe a sense of like trying to really listen to the concerns of the trans community and to reevaluate like certain kind of like policies and institutional kind of like approaches that it can have. I will say that the government's kind of like a decision to double the funding for LGBT groups is pretty heartening. It's good.
We'll get to that. We'll get to that. Carl's getting ahead of the slides.
Yeah, sorry about that.
That's all right.
What I'm really hoping again is that like we can see that instead of again like developing policies based on a philosophy professor's kind of like imaginary about the issues of gender, that we're really, which is kind of like I think is what you can get to sometimes when you see like attempts to legislate gender identity is that instead of being grounded in the experiences of trans people and the experiences of trans people in the healthcare system, in the educational system, and developing evidence-based policies around the outcomes of treatment and the outcomes of like basically like different laws, different kind of like ways that you can change your name, that you can, you know, whatever else. It's a multi-institutional thing that we can get back to, again, reality-based policy.
Right, of course.
Instead of it being based again on
Facebook videos.
People's cultural fears,
Sure.
I think, in that sense of like just being like, oh, like I am scared of a big bad athlete scaring the women of my life, right? Like something like that, you know, it can really
this pure imaginary fear.
Yeah. Like we will often see laws that are based on like trying to protect children. A lot of like you know, like the laws in Alberta, I think, were framed in terms of parental rights, which is concerning framing, because I do think that children's rights are also very important. You know, like youth's rights are very important. They are very sidelined by this. So like the laws in Alberta that, you know, say that, for example, like that teachers would have to disclose if a child wanted to socially transition in the classroom. That is, I think, a breach of that child's rights, you know? I think that there should be some degree of confidentiality between youth, like over, you know, youth and doctors and youth and like that they would have like some kind of like agency in their own treatment. I think that's very important, and you can think of many cases why this would be enshrined into law, right? Like, and instead, I think you know, I think a lot of fears are basically parents' fears that their children might turn out to be trans. Right. At the root of it, that's a big part of it, or that they might have watched, you know, a video of a prominent detransitioner or someone like that, and fear that their children might be influenced in a certain way, that they might follow a trend, and then that might affect their entire life afterwards. Which again is not really. I think these are fantasy scenarios. I don't think that they're
statistically. Is that kind of fear represented in like let's say people who detransition or anything like that?
Yeah, I think there should be, you know, obviously more research done into detransition, but I don't think there is a strong body of evidence that this is like this happens in a really statistically significant proportion of people, and I think that, you know, it just. Obviously, like I want to be respectful to people's experiences. Like there are like attempts to, for example, to get more kind of like studies into this. But the rate of regret for trans procedures for it's very very low. Like so again, I think, you know, there could be some attempt to, you know, sensitively look at why people might detransition. Overwhelmingly, it seems that the evidence that we have is that the major reasons people give for detransitioning has to do with the discrimination that they experience, right? So it's kind of a delicate kind of like topic in a way. I think it should be treated sensitively, and I think people should really actually conduct evidence-based kind of research. And what we're seeing instead is that we get like documentaries or videos that are very sensationalistic and that take one or two people's experiences and then really, you know, kind of like extrapolate a lot from a couple of people's experiences, which is not how we should develop policy. It's not how we should develop. It's not how science works either. Right.
Yeah. Thank you for that. Can we skip 2 slides ahead, please? So I like us to talk about this article. Yeah. So now we're going more into the federal ring. I mean, I believe you already brought up Pierre Poilievre, but here we have an article from February 21st, 2024. Poilievre backs banning trans women from sports, changing rooms, and bathrooms. This is in CBC News. If you go to the next slide, we'll have a little quote from the federal Conservative Party leader. Here he says, female spaces should be exclusively for females, not for biological males. Poilievre said this in Kitchener, Ontario. And this sort of follows the general angling of the Conservative Party, sort of grabbing onto trans issues is kind of like to rally up their base, right? To kind of shore up votes, to kind of perhaps even propagate this kind of fear or this kind of sensationalization that they do among their bases. Just last fall, 69% of the delegates to the Conservative Party's policy convention voted in favor of a motion that said those under the age of 18 should be prohibited from accessing life-altering medicinal or surgical interventions to treat gender confusion and dysphoria. So here we have... I guess this article gets into the kind of... I guess their policy positions and the kind of rhetoric they're evoking about trans issues and how there's this whole slew of... I guess policies that they want to put forward, ranging from like healthcare, but also to like changing rooms and bathrooms, which I'm not quite sure is federal jurisdiction.
Yeah, it's like how enforceable is that, right?
Yeah. It's like once you're in the bathroom, that's federal territory.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and I mean those are based, like I think the bathroom bills and the sports bills are really based in fear, basically, and fear mongering. Because again, I think there are many sensationalist videos that you can watch online where you will, I think that, I think it can be kind of like quite violent in terms of like what the actual imaginary of what might happen in those spaces. I will say, a lot of trans people who are quote unquote biologically male, according to Pierre Poilievre, we could not tell apart from a cis woman, right? Like, so there would be a sense of like whenever they try and pass these bathroom bills that this would really, if they were actually applied as was on the kind of like original kind of birth certificate of someone before they were whatever, it would actually cause like a lot of like existential angst for these people, right? Like, because it's just like a lot of trans men also. If you've been on testosterone for a long time, I think the average cis woman could not tell apart from a cis man, and then would be very, very, very freaked out that all these biological women are in their bathrooms, right? Like, so there's a little bit of like an attempt to kind of like legislate gender around fear of stereotypes, and really just like I think a kind of imaginary, right? Like rather than on any kind of like actual threat to people, right?
How before we talk about how enforceable these are, how enforceable do you think, like, let's say like banning trans women from sports, changing rooms, bathrooms, how enforceable do you think that actually is?
I don't think the bathrooms is very enforceable, but if any attempts at enforcing it would be scary and dystopian. Right. Yeah, I think what it could do is that it could cause even more kind of like people to like, scared cis people to feel empowered to police other people's genders in bathrooms. So just like, I think the aim would be to increase a climate of social violence, but you could not ID people and ask them to actually produce their birth certificate before entering a bathroom.
Yeah, I do not know where my birth certificate is.
Yeah, it would be pretty scary. And I think it would actually really dramatically inconvenience cis people and cause a lot of confusion if it were to be applied. However, I think it can be also a kind of like issue or a kind of like these attempts to legislate these bathrooms can get into a way of social progress in terms of like many institutions are trying to add to the number of like gender neutral bathrooms that they might have. So like again, these kind of like conversations about like a climate of kind of like violence in regular public spaces.
I want to get your comment on the that 69% of conservative delegates voting towards voting in favor of a motion that would ban those under the age of 18 from accessing life-altering medicinal or surgical interventions to treat gender confusion and dysphoria. I believe this is what we're sort of seeing in Alberta.
Yeah, it is, and Pierre Poilievre saying that he would ban puberty blockers for people under 18 is really one of like the big examples of that. Puberty does tend to happen before 18.
Right. You can't
that
really
is what they're for.
Right. It's like it would be like prescribing Rogaine to a toddler or something, I guess.
Yeah. And I think it just, the majority of times puberty blockers are prescribed to teenagers don't have to do with gender identity, and they don't ruin those teenagers' lives, right? Like it's just... it's sad. Like I think it's policy based on again imagination gone wild. In terms of like how widespread these interventions are, what are their effects on the body and whatever else. And they're seeing that instead of like trusting, a really large body of evidence about transition at this point, including like the survey that came out in 2019 that really does show that like these interventions are positive, that they have, a life-saving positive kind of like impact on trans youth, instead of looking again kind of like at the holistic picture of this, that they are ignoring, brushing aside the actual facts on the case, and then really pandering to, again, an imagination about what could happen if an insane, crazy doctor was preying on you. It's really regrettable. As we saw in the survey, that like many transgender teens kind of already fear doctors. I think that this will really dissuade also doctors from giving teenagers affirming care in other provinces, right? Like where they can say like, oh, well, this is a very controversial, scary issue.
I don't want to touch it.
I don't want to touch it, right? Like, so I think it's a big step back also in terms of like the social climate, the institutional climate about this.
I have questions about, to bring things back to Montreal. So in that original article that you wrote in the Canadian Dimension, you talked a bit about the state of trans healthcare and I guess the services available to trans people in Montreal. Could you talk a little bit about the state of those services right now and what they used to be like and what they're kind of like now?
Yeah, I mean, like I don't have like a huge survey of this. When I wrote this article, it was just because one of the clinics that I had gone to and a lot of my friends had gone to had become privatized. Since then, I can say that there's like been a couple of like doctors that have shown up and taken new patients. So I can't exactly speak to like the wait times or
Sure.
whatever else. But cautious optimism. I hope that there is like hope there is a way that like more services are brought into the public service. There's been kind of like some expansions in terms of like insurance coverage for trans healthcare. At like different student insurances, whatever else. Again, maybe this isn't exactly my job, so it's like not something that I have like a broad picture about. It is concerning to see. I read an article recently about how more of Ontario's clinics are going private. I think this is another thing that you will see is that basically, even though general practitioner doctors could prescribe hormones, for example, for gender dysphoria, they don't, and they don't want to. They have a sense of like, oh, well, not my issue, right? And want to refer trans people to private clinics or specialists, and that a lot of these specialists are actually overwhelmed with the demand from the trans community, and then decide to go private because of this. So that's kind of like a dynamic that happens often. And what happens, this basically means that if they are private clinics, that like any working class transgender person, a lot of youth can't access service. Anyone that basically wouldn't have the means to pay $200 for an appointment, for example. So it's the privatization of services is like a huge threat to trans healthcare. I think it kind of, if you want to talk about like the dystopian imaginary of like people like kind of Wild West, kind of like early development of capitalism, kind of like snake oil salesman kind of reality where people are seeing unlicensed professionals, like this is privatizing every clinic that can offer trans care is the road to that. Like it really is this thing where you're leaving people to not be able to trust their doctors, not be able to like receive a standard course of treatment, not be able to like understanding like conditions that they might have that would interact with their healthcare. Like really like bringing this out of the public realm, I think is like quite horrible, not because I think that the private services that are offered by these trans clinics are bad, but actually because they're so inaccessible that they leave a lot of people in this kind of like no man's land where they can't get treatment.
To make them more accessible would be to keep them public then.
Yeah, exactly.
Right. No, thank you for that. Let's go to our next slide.
Yeah.
There we go. This is what you were bringing up before.
Yeah.
So we have Quebec doubling budget for fight against homophobia and transphobia. This is in CBC News, which was published December 14th, 2023. The $23.7 million to be spent between 2023 and 2028 is the largest amount ever granted to this cause in Quebec since the very first plan to fight homophobia was adopted by Jean Charest's Liberal government in 2011. It's more than twice the amount invested in the previous plan, some $10 million for the 2017 to 2022 period.
Yeah.
What do you think about that?
I think it's pretty good. I think this is a cause for real celebration. A lot of LGBT groups were underfunded. I read a recent survey also on like funding in LGBT groups. I will say that like there are a lot of places in Quebec that have no LGBT services, basically. And, you know, going back to that survey, I talked about the Being Safe, Being Me survey in 2019 across Canada, really showed just how much rural youth were at risk.
Dans les régions.
Yeah, dans les régions. And there are many régions in Quebec where there are no LGBT services. And they're needed. They're obviously very necessary. So I think that maybe also like I hope that this kind of like large envelope of cash will go a little bit to some community groups that are not in Montreal, basically.
Well, of course.
I mean, I'd love if a lot of it went to groups in Montreal as well, but being that I am located there, but
straight to your house.
Yes. But I will say, like, about half of this money is going straight to community groups.
Yeah, incredible.
There was a response by Quebec Solidaire representative, M&A, that basically did point out that this was going towards LGBT projects rather than kind of like towards the mission of community groups. This has been a kind of like wider issue in the nonprofit sector where a lot of like government funding is for short-term projects and basically larger kind of administration tasks are not eligible for funding, which can be quite difficult because then really the projects are kind of ad hoc, stop and start, and many groups in regions or whatever might not have like the full scale of funding that they need to really
like
get
set
started.
Roots, yeah, of course.
Exactly.
Build an institution, yeah.
Yeah, and you'll find that if you want to kind of like properly plan out a service, it's quite demanding. You have to like try and evaluate what is needed in a region. And kind of work from there. So that, again, I hope that there is also like some sense of optic of reform in how the government maybe like attributes funding towards community groups. That being said, I think it is kind of positive, and I hope that, especially groups focusing on trans issues in the regions might get a little bit of this funding and be able to offer services because I think they're really, really necessary.
Incredible. Yeah, no, here I have if we go to the next slide, we'll see a comment from the head of the Conseil Québécois LGBT, a federation of 70 organizations, calls the plan, James Galantino calls the plan historic.
It is historic, yeah.
And a sigh of relief.
Yeah.
Allow his group to breathe a sigh of relief, excuse me, yeah. So to go into the details a little more, the complete plan includes a total of 44 measures, including some adapted from the previous plan. Community groups will get up to $11 million of the total budget, or 55%. Among other things, the government plans to create an LGBTQ plus award as early as 2024, as well as a web directory that will bring together all the tools and resources developed as a part of this action plan. Over $4 million will be invested to recognize sexual groups and gender diversity through an awareness-raising strategy aimed at the general public. More targeted content for the sports world and health professionals in particular is also planned. The Bureau de lutte contre l'homophobie et la transphobie will receive $4 million to ensure its continuity within the Quebec government. The remaining several $1 million will be used, among other things, to create information tools on the rights of LGBTQ plus people and to train public service workers in the realities experienced by LGBTQ plus people. So I guess this ties into some of the things we were talking about before about, I guess, some of these public employees or people who work in the kind of public service industry, not industry, but sector. Thank you. Yeah, that's the right word. I was sort of not really like wanting to touch the issue, right, because it's so unknown. But perhaps this kind of education will go towards that.
Yeah, I hope so. I hope that like some of the groups can change, like achieve some kind of meaningful change, both in social attitudes and also in terms of like how institutions kind of like treat gender diverse people. I will say it's very common for gender diverse people to experience discrimination in kind of like pretty much every public institution, it's very common, for example, just for forms to just require you to choose between being a man and a woman for no reason. Like many of these forms don't actually have like a purpose where they're using this information for some kind of like services that they're providing or anything essential. Often it is really just whether or not they'll call you Mr. or Mrs. in the email. Which is like really, at this point, you should eliminate these kinds of like questions or like, find a way to kind of like...
Save the ink. Don't type Mr. or Mrs.
Yeah, exactly. Like there could be ways to kind of like make more services a little bit more accessible. I mean, these forms are like, I don't think they're anyone's like the top of their list, but they're kind of like a, kind of daily kind of routine ways in which you can experience barriers or feel misunderstood by public services. I will also say that like, obviously, a lot of the work is on social attitudes, and social attitudes and public policy kind of go hand in hand. I mean, like with trans healthcare, a lot of like the change that needs to happen is institutional. It's within kind of like these kind of like broader systems. So there, on the one hand, yes, you have like the kind of federal and provincial laws and how they kind of like interact with these systems, but there's a lot of change that can be accomplished just through having a couple of people who are conscious of these kinds of issues within public-facing institutions. That can go actually quite a long way.
How do you mean people having a few people who are conscious in these public institutions? You mean like sort of like people who set policy, or?
Yeah, exactly. Like and it can be kind of like basically any kind of public institutions. Even if we're talking about like different sports leagues or like whatever else, a lot of like sectors of society have just never thought about how gender diverse people interact with the service at all. Like just at all. And just even having a couple of people that are like conscious of this and maybe trying to foster more inclusive environments can go a long way towards also changing social attitudes. Because again, like that trans people can feel more accepted in different areas of society and are treated, with respect in different areas of society goes a long way towards also changing their health outcomes, their mental health outcomes. As we kind of like saw in pretty much every study on this.
Right, no,
like,
of course.
So there's a real back and forth between these things. I really think that there is a lot of work in terms of social attitudes towards trans people. I think it is extremely easy in a population that maybe has never heard of trans people to really act like as if it's a completely new phenomena, as if it's completely like the Wild West in terms of like treatment, like, oh, like anything goes. This is like,
of course, yeah.
I don't know if this, exactly. I don't know if this is actually the right metaphor for this, but that basically that there are no standards.
I'm just imagining trans people wearing cowboy hats. So I think that's what that metaphor is doing to me.
But like the gender affirming surgeries are as old as insulin, right? Like, and if that gives you kind of an idea, like we don't talk about insulin as a completely new treatment.
The schools are forcing insulin on the kids.
Yeah, so I think there is like kind of like maybe obviously kind of like whenever there's like pro-LGBT kind of like attempts to fix kind of social attitudes, they can feel a little corny, when you go through them, they can feel a little bit like wow, this is a very small band-aid on top of a big issue. But at the same time, we do see that like youth, for example, are much, much more tolerant of LGBT people than they were, when I was in school, right? Like there are broad social changes that have occurred in the past 20 years, and it is partly
the floor has been raised, I guess, for some social cultural understanding.
I think so, and I think so in a really huge way, and I think maybe I hope that the rest of the public kind of catches up to this. Yeah.
Well, hopefully this LGBTQ plus award will help with that. What do you think about that? This kind of caught my eye. I wonder how they're gonna
do an award. Yeah. Well, who's to say, right? Like, I can't say I'm one for kind of award shows, but I think maybe underlining also that LGBT people have made really large contributions to Quebec society. I think can be important for some people. Like I don't put a lot of faith personally in award ceremonies, but they can feel a little bit corny over the top. But at the same time, it's kind of undeniable.
There's some recognition, I guess, from it, right?
Yeah, exactly. Like, and also like fostering kind of like role models for queer youth is important. It can feel very difficult, if you're a kind of Quebecois youth, you might not feel like you have a role model. You might not feel like, I can draw on this history of people that have a kind of a similar kind of background to me. it's not just Quebecois youth obviously that are affected by this. But
Sure.
Like having a broad and diverse base of kind of like role models, I think is really important.
Hopefully, the whole world will be watching the Quebecois LGBTQ plus award show.
Yeah, exactly.
These are all the topics I kind of wanted to bring up. Anything you wanted to add to what we said?
No, I hope this kind of covered.
This was an incredibly informative discussion. I learned a lot. Thank you very much for coming on to our show, Carl.
All right, thank you.
Of course. Stay tuned for Hello Good Bylines with Savanna Craig. See you soon. And we are back on Metropolis. This segment, everyone knows its name. Hello Good Bylines. With Savanna Craig. How are you doing, Savanna?
I'm doing well, thanks, Kalden. How are you?
I'm doing all right. Thank you for asking. So, what do you have for us today on Hello Good Byline?
Yeah, I'm here to talk about a few things, most notably arms embargo and self-immolation.
Self-immolation, arms embargo. Yeah, it's those two huge topics.
Yeah, we'll start with arms embargo.
Please.
So this has... essentially, the push for an arms embargo on Israel has been a topic for a few months now, but it's come up more notably in the last week. I attended a protest on Friday, February 23rd, so this past Friday, where essentially a small group of activists, around 10 activists, blocked the entrance to the Port Authority of Montreal. This entrance is essentially where workers at the port can come and leave to work. They were there for about approximately an hour until police officers threatened to make arrests, which is when they dispersed. Essentially, they told me that this was more a form of protest to promote awareness of the importance of blocking ports and especially to impose an arms embargo on Israel, for Canada to impose an arms embargo on Israel. And yes, as I said, they weren't really ready to be arrested, but essentially just wanted to get the word out there.
Interesting. I think we've seen this call for an arms embargo from, Labor Against the Arms Trade has always been kind of angling for that as well. And just recently, in the past 2 weeks, I believe the UN also made that call. They made the suggestion that countries start blocking the arms shipments, and I believe a few countries have to avoid being complicit in the genocide in Palestine.
Yes. I actually have the countries noted. Belgium, Italy, Spain, and the Netherlands.
Netherlands, yeah, that's one.
Have all placed an arms embargo on Israel, and a Japanese company, Itochu Corporation, announced on February 5th that they'll end its partnerships with Israeli weapons manufacturer Elbit Systems by the end of February.
Oh, incredible.
Yeah.
I didn't know about that one.
Yeah. No, not as widely promoted. But yeah, no, I'm glad you brought up the UN push. Essentially, for those who don't know, UN experts are warning against the sending of military exports to Israeli, I quote, any transfer of weapons or ammunition to Israel that would be used in Gaza is likely to violate international humanitarian law and must cease immediately. This was released on the same day as the protest I attended last Friday. And they also said that all states must ensure respect for international humanitarian law by parties to an armed conflict as required by the 1949 Geneva Conventions and customary international law. Experts essentially said that given Israel's patterns of behavior, it is to be assumed that these weapons will be used to violate international law.
Of course, yeah. Well, it's good on this little group of protesters for trying to raise awareness around that. I think it's important that the people who work along these, supply chains, who are involved with the labor of actually bringing the arms there, are aware of this as well. Because sometimes you're just sort of like part of the process so much that like the kind of reality of what's being kind of shipped might kind of like evade you. But it's good that these protesters are there, I guess, reminding the workers there what is being transported, you know?
Absolutely. And there was kind of mixed reactions from workers. I know that before I arrived, there was either one or two workers that actually tried to drive into the crowd. Someone sent me a photo afterwards of like a car kind of like dirt stain on their pants.
Okay.
But at the end, I did see that someone was trying to turn in, and they were like, what's going on? Why can't I get to work? And they had pamphlets that they were handing out explaining what they were doing, the importance of an arms embargo. And I actually saw the person say, like, smile at the end and say, good luck. And then they kind of like rerouted their drive. So that was interesting. But I did take a bit of video if you want to check it out.
I would love to. It's behind me.
We'll be here until Montreal stops murdering the people of Palestine by sending the means of murder. What do we want? Embargo. When do we want it? Now. If we don't get it, shut it down. If we don't get it, shut it down. If we don't get it, shut it down. The occupation, shut it down.
I don't think that there's very much awareness around the fact that we're shipping weapons to Israel. We know that we're shipping weapons to Israel through Montreal's ports. We know in the recent Maple article that they've actually approved $28.5 million of exports in the 2 months after October 7th, which exceeds the previous annual record. So we know that they're increasing their arms exports exponentially. The people of Canada have been screaming for months at them to do something about it. We know that the majority of Canadians don't support Israel's actions, and thousands of Canadians have been taking to the street every single weekend for 5 months to ask them to do their part to stop this genocide. And I mean, only a few weeks ago did Trudeau call for a ceasefire, and still, despite calling for a ceasefire, they continue to send arms to Israel. Our government has refused to place an arms embargo, which is the bare minimum. This is something that's going to have to be changed from the outside due to sanctions, due to stopping the supply of weapons. We know that weapons are going through our ports to Israel, so that's something concrete that we can do, is say, no, I refuse to allow weapons to go from my city to a state that is committing genocide.
So, right in front of the Port Authority on the, I think it's just at the tip of Point St. Charles. It's near the Costco.
It's a bit of a walk.
It
I
is,
think
yeah.
the closest metro is Charlevoix.
Yeah, it's a decent walk. I mean, that whole area is just sort of industrial warehouses or, I guess, logistics. I know Canada Post has a little warehouse there as well. But yeah, I mean, important figures that person brought up: $28.7 million of dollars of military exports since October 7th.
In the first 2 months.
In the first 2 months
Yeah.
since October, yeah.
Yeah, since October 7th, which is kind of interesting, I think, given the fact that there's like I wouldn't say that there's support for Palestine, but I think the Liberal government really tries to, obviously backs Israel and, has stated time and time again, like, Israel has the right to self-defense. But, there's also been some words of sympathy for Palestinians, but I think just the proof and, after October 7th, those first 2 months, they provided $28.5 million worth of military exports. That's a huge amount, and that really does show who the government is sided with.
Of course. I mean, the Liberal government, they're experts at, like, rhetoric, right, of saying the right thing. But, I mean, they've even called for a ceasefire. Like, Trudeau's called for a ceasefire. But, like, this... It's interesting to call for a ceasefire, but then still be sending military shipments. It's like, you don't have to wait for them to call the ceasefire. You can actually help the ceasefire happen by making sure they don't have this kind of military goods it takes to continue a war.
Absolutely, yeah. I also there was another protest, the Montreal protest, which happens every week, has been happening since early October. It took place outside Metro Champlain on February 25th, so this past Sunday. And in one of the speeches, an organizer said that they're actually organizing a national protest outside of Parliament in Ottawa, which happened in November, but it's happening again on March 9th. And they brought up the importance of the day before and the day after this date. The day before is International Women's Day. And they cited, how out of 70% of civilians that have been killed in Gaza since October 7th, 70% accounts for women and children. And as well as the day after, they said that this is an important date as it marks the beginning of Ramadan. And, they essentially cited the significance identifying how Palestinians in Gaza are being forcefully starved, and they're going to be continuing this during Ramadan and not able to celebrate traditionally, as essentially they don't have food. They're using grain for animals to make bread. Yeah. And in this national protest, they said that they will be asking or pushing for an arms embargo on Israel, as well as Canada to reinstate funding for UNRWA and an immediate ceasefire.
Yeah, would you could you remind the audience what UNRWA is? The UNWRA?
Yes, essentially UNRWA is a United Nations organization that provides humanitarian relief for Palestinians, and essentially Israel recently accused 12 UNRWA workers of being involved in the October 7th Al-Aqsa flood. And almost immediately after, numerous countries revoked their funding to UNRWA, including Canada. And UNRWA has essentially said that, this is a catastrophic situation. And as a result, it will only further increase the humanitarian catastrophe in Gaza and, significantly limit Gazans' access to food and water.
Yeah, terrible. I think it's just, again, just a bit of hypocrisy for, the 12 people who might have been involved with the Al-Aqsa flood to revoke funding for those 12, but then not revoke funding from Israel for the war crimes, not to revoke funding from Israel for just the onslaught, this completely one-sided genocide against Palestinians. Is quite the doublespeak.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah. It's not surprising, but
no, at this point, astonishing is a good word. Yeah, because at this point, it's hard to be surprised by these government decisions, because I guess it's been clear from the start where they side, but it's astonishing, disappointing, disgusting.
Absolutely. I thought that, in the last week that I've attended protests, reported on protests, it's been interesting that arms embargo has come up so much, because in the last few weeks I've just been speaking with people around me, people who attend protests or, have maybe been attending protests a little less. And the most constant complaint I've heard about these protests is that there's not enough of a push for an arms embargo and direct action, such as blocking, not specifically the Port Authority, but the ports themselves, in order to really apply pressure on an arms embargo and draw attention to, the fact that Canada is exporting so many military goods to Israel. And I thought it would be interesting to actually take a look at, what type of exports are we sending? So I did an ATIP to Global Affairs Canada in early 2022. So these numbers are between January 1st, 2017 and March 30th, 2022. And I was just
a 3-month period. From January to March, you're saying?
2017 to
okay.
2022.
2017, I missed that part. Okay,
I was trying to do math much faster and it's not working.
Multiple years.
Yeah. So, we have a few years down. Essentially, what I was looking for at the time was, how Canada provides humanitarian reliefs for conflicts that they are involved in by, military exports. So at the time, I was looking into, Canada's humanitarian relief to both Palestine and Yemen, as well as how Canada is fueling these conflicts, caused by Israel and caused by Saudi Arabia by essentially sending them military exports. So I asked for all exports between these years. They said it would take them, not them, the computers, 2 years to give me this answer.
You just said, I got time.
I mean, I was down to wait 2 years. I was going to be ready. So essentially, they asked me to go through the list of exports and highlight a few. So that's what I did. I mean, I kind of chose a range between like surveillance equipment, bombs, guns, things like this. So it's kind of a random amount of information, but I thought the numbers were kind of interesting. So yeah, I'll just kind of list them off.
Please.
So there was 480,000 and 428 smooth bore weapons with a caliber of less than 20 millimeters. This also includes other arms and automatic weapons with a caliber of 12.7 millimeters or less, as well as accessories. I spoke with a researcher who reports on arms military exports in Canada, and he said that this is likely to be components of rifles. So this is, almost 500,000 rifles to Israel within a 5-year period. I do want to note, though, that these numbers are approval of permits.
Sure.
So I don't actually know if all of these were sent to Israel, but Canada allowed it to be sent.
That would have been like the maximum number if they produced that much.
Exactly.
That's sort of what they're aiming for.
Exactly. And then this next one is just over 61,000 smooth bore weapons. I'm getting really into these sizes with a caliber of 20 millimeters or more.
Okay.
Other weapons or armaments with a caliber greater than 12.7 millimeters, as well as projectors and accessories and specially designed components. So I really wish I had some photos of what exactly these are.
Smooth bore, 12 millimeter, sure.
Yeah. I'm not a military expert, but I mean, it is showing that essentially these are essentially rifle gun components, as well as accessories used, to shoot Palestinians,
Right.
to arm their military for whatever it is they do.
The caliber would be, I believe, referring to the size of the bullet or projectile.
Exactly.
So you have kind of, I guess, smaller ones and then larger ones as well.
Exactly.
They get options.
Yeah, they have some options, different sizes. This one really caught my eye. There was 112,651 bombs, torpedoes, rockets, missiles, and other explosive devices and charges, as well as related equipment and accessories, which were sent to Israel, or allowed to be sent to Israel.
Right. The permits for them.
The permits, exactly. And then there was 31,442 fire control, surveillance, and warning equipments and related systems, test and alignment and countermeasure equipment, specially designed for military use and specially designed components and accessories. Not too many details on what this is.
I think it's good when we get these details because it's like so much of like, I find it's always good to have these kinds of details, even if they are kind of like sometimes boring and I guess even like inaccessible to our imaginations. Because you read this out and there's so much jargon to it that we don't understand. But it's good to have at least some. I think once people do look it up and once people do actually have the visual of it, it's like, oh, this is actually like, this is an example of what's being sent, right? It's not just like, oh, arms, question mark, could that be? It's like, no, there's bullets, rifle components. These are the kind of materials that we're sending over there that sort of allows them to kind of continue this onslaught. Exactly,
yeah. And I thought that was important to do, especially, after we brought up the fact that in 2 months, Canada sent Israel $28.5 million.
0.7. It's 28.5 or 28.7.
Let's look it up.
I'm looking at my computer too.
It was the... You're going to beat me? 28.7 military exports. 28.5.
0.5? Looks like I was wrong, folks.
Let me see. Yeah. 0.7 is not coming up.
That's okay.
Sorry.
That's all right.
So close.
2 off. 0.2 off.
But I think, when I saw that number, I was like, that's a lot of money.
Yeah, and they're saying it beat the annual, I think, for the year before. So
Yeah.
it clearly shows that it's not just sending military exports as usual. They've actually ramped it up quite a bit.
Exactly, yeah. And I think, when I see a number like that, I'm like, I can't even fathom how much money that is.
Oh, yeah.
And I can't even fathom, okay, what does that mean? What are we exactly sending them? So obviously these numbers are 2017 to 2022, so I don't know exactly what was involved in the money sent October and November. But I think this kind of gives an idea of over 5 years, a small glimpse into the history. I mean, obviously they wouldn't run the numbers for me, the 2 years of numbers, but out of the ones that I selected, this is what I know that they sent me.
It gives us a glimpse.
It gives us a glimpse. And I think, at the time that I was looking into the story of how, Canada provides humanitarian aid to countries that are also complicit in damaging and harming, I thought it was interesting that, 2 years ago during Israel's bombardment of Gaza, Canada sent a massive amount of money to rebuild Gaza. To rebuild Gaza. But at the same time, that was in 2021. And, we have the numbers here that, over 100,000 bombs, torpedoes, rockets, missiles, other explosive devices were sent to Israel and likely used. I guess that was the end of the dates I requested was March 2022. So it was before May 2021. So yeah, some of these would have been sent during Israel's last bombardment of Gaza. So it's just kind of backwards that Canada is, so heavily arming Israel, but also, providing humanitarian relief to rebuild Gaza at the same time.
Yeah. I mean, I think they make money both on the destruction and the fixing. I think that's what it is.
Absolutely. This next one I thought was quite bizarre. They sent one. Chemical agents, biological agents, riot control agents, radioactive materials, related equipment, components, and materials. I was like, one?
Maybe a tear gas gun? Would that count?
I don't know. I mean, it has to be significant.
Might I read that?
Yeah. I can pull up the actual...
1, chemical agents, biological agents, riot control agents, radioactive materials, related equipment, components, and materials. Interesting.
Let me bring up the...
Oh yeah, we're in the spreadsheets now.
Wait, I'm in the wrong one. Okay, here we are. Yeah, 2.7. Yeah. So here you go. It's this one.
Yeah, just one.
Just one.
Interesting. I wonder.
Yeah.
I wonder.
Was it big?
Yeah. Who knows? It could be some kind of... I mean, it could be anything.
Yeah.
But it's interesting that's just one.
And then we sent 11 complete delivery systems. So this involves rocket systems, missiles, space launch vehicles, unmanned aerial systems, target drones.
Sure.
11 is pretty small as well. But I thought that was interesting to highlight.
No, yeah. I mean, 11 is small, but drones, I mean, they add a lot of reconnaissance info for whatever 11 units that get to use those drones or whatever it might be. It gives them a lot more of a range.
Yeah. The impact is huge.
Yeah.
And I thought something that was interesting that I found out a couple years ago when I was doing research into Canada arming Israel was that there are loopholes within Canada's military exports, not just to Israel, but in general. So one of these loopholes is they're called subcontracted exports. So essentially, for example, Pratt & Whitney, they're located in Longueuil. They used to develop engines for P-16 aircrafts for the Israeli army. Essentially, I think it was in 2020 or 2021, Israel decided to use another company. So Pratt & Whitney no longer develops their engines for these warcrafts. But after Pratt & Whitney essentially developed these engines, they were being sent to the U.S. And then whichever company assembled this plane would then send it to Israel. So essentially in our records for Canadian exports, this engine would not be counted as an export to Israel. It would be counted as an export to the U.S.,
right.
even though the U.S. military isn't using it. Yeah.
Right, because I just get it, just on a technicality, it's going over there first.
Exactly.
I wonder how much there is that sort of not including in the military exports to Israel because they have sort of other middle people they go through.
Absolutely.
It'd be interesting to have like the full kind of the full journey tracked, because that'd be another way to kind of look at the data.
And then another loophole I thought was really interesting. The same thing with this engine, for example, is that even if it was, being sent to to Israel or the U.S. or anywhere, there is a chance that it could not be titled as a military export, but as a commodity, because essentially this engine could be used for a car.
Sure.
It's not manufactured for a car, but since it could be used, as a general...
A plane engine?
Yeah, yeah.
You think they're putting those in cars?
No, I don't think they are.
But just to say, it could be used for like civilian or like non-military purposes.
Yeah, I mean, essentially, this came up...
I'd love to see that car. I just want to say.
That should be your next car.
Yeah. Where'd you get that? It's like, I stole a shipment.
Yeah, I'll keep an eye out for you at Pratt & Whitney. Essentially, this example was used when I spoke to a researcher at Project Plowshares, is that, like we both kind of laughed at the situation as well, where it's like, they're likely being used for these aircrafts. But it's just kind of like terminology used by Global Affairs Canada that, it's an engine, like it's not necessarily used for war.
Sure.
But,
They get, I mean, they're in the bureaucracy of it, they know how to like sort of like skirt things by like on technicalities, right? Because technically it's not being solely used for the military. We can't like label it as such, but I think the GAC needs to sort of, I think I would love to see a more kind of like nuanced sort of like boxes of like just because something is not solely or technically used for military purposes doesn't mean it's like scot-free off of that, right? It'd be nice for them to broaden these definitions.
I think so too. Maybe my request wouldn't take 2 years then.
I don't know. The way, I mean, it's a gargantuan Leviathan system, and the way they get back, the way they kind of get by is like they put a lot of the work on the people who make the information requests, and there's not just journalists, right? There's like people who work in government as well. On the onus is on you to give specific questions, because if you give a broad answer, then they're gonna just be like, sorry, it's too broad. You got to work on the definition, and like we're not gonna do anything about it.
100%. Yeah, very true. That's essentially the numbers I have.
Yeah, no,
do with it what you will.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. I think it's kind of illuminating. Just it's great having just a mental picture of like the things that Canada is sending either to Israel directly or through the U.S. and potentially back to Israel.
Yeah. Especially because when we hear stories out of Gaza or the West Bank as well, we hear Palestinians being shot, Palestinians being bombed, Palestinians at checkpoints being surveilled, and these were all things that I just brought up that shows, at least between 2017 to 2022, we were sending these supplies. So Canada's involved.
Yeah, there you go, undeniable.
Yeah, absolutely.
And it's getting more involved.
Yeah, exactly, getting more involved. So I think I'd like to do more with these numbers. I definitely have a lot more research to do to
2 years amount.
probably to really pinpoint what exactly these exports look like, maybe how many engines are going to the US and then going to Israel. So hopefully I can come back and talk about that.
It'd be really interesting if you were able to follow just one and just see its trajectory and the kind of path it goes through, the process.
That's probably how I should do it, because I think I'll go insane if I try to do them all.
Going through the big picture for that kind of stuff is kind of it's a lot to swallow because it's just you have your eye is on the entire industrial process of it, which is just like maddening.
Yeah, it really is. It really is.
What's the other topic you have for us today on Hello Good Byline?
Yes, I wanted to talk about self-immolation. I'm sure, as many of you know, on Sunday, Aaron Bushnell, who was on active duty in the U.S. Air Force, set himself on fire outside of the U.S. Outside of the Israeli embassy in Washington D.C. Essentially, he live streamed this on Twitch. And before he set himself on fire, he said that he was engaging himself in an extreme form of protest and that he cannot be complicit in Israel's genocide of Palestine anymore. Yeah. Did you see the video?
I could not stomach watching it. I've seen lots of self-immolations in the past because it was since 2008, 2009, it's been kind of the go-to protest method for Tibetans within Tibet, some in India and Nepal as well. And the videos are just like gruesome, right? Because I mean, everyone's kind of like been slightly burned by something, right? So it's just the imagination of it being like your whole body. I mean, there's a time when like there's like videos coming out every week of these self-immolations in Tibet. So I didn't need to watch it to know sort of what was going on. It's a very big decision to make.
It really is. Yeah, I haven't been able to stop thinking about it.
Of course, I mean it's on the front of so many people's minds. I think the action is because of the like the spectacle, the sight of it is so like astonishing, kind of so striking. I'll say that it's been like getting so much coverage and like for like good reason, right? There's like Aaron Bushnell is at like the sort of intersection of so many different things. The fact that he's an active U.S. Airman, the fact that he's working in their information systems. I think he's like he was on some anarchist boards talking about like some classified information he had, and then to make the decision to set himself on fire, to make a statement about it. Against the U.S. Involvement in the genocide in Gaza. I think it's an incredibly... I'm very careful more with my words about this because it's just incredibly... There's so much thought put into it, and the end result is such a striking image of someone effectively like just like committing suicide on a live platform, right? It's gotten everyone's attention, which is I believe was the intention.
Absolutely, yeah. No, I think it's interesting what you bring up about like everyone's burned themselves and we know this terrible feeling, but it's like to fathom that, like your whole body on fire. It's really horrific. But I think when I heard this happen, I had this moment of like, oh no, what are the reports going to say? Yeah. And I think a lot of people had this moment of, oh no, so many media outlets who reported on it essentially said that, active duty member of the U.S. Air Force, I'm just, giving like a gist of what most of them were saying.
Paraphrasing.
Yeah, paraphrasing. Thank you. Set himself on fire in Washington, D.C., or set himself on fire outside the Israeli embassy in Washington, D.C. Very, very few of them mentioned the word protest, mentioned the word Gaza or Palestine. I believe
those were his last words, Free Palestine.
Yeah, his last words. I think Fox News might have said it, which I thought was interesting.
I mean... To their credit, they love something sensational, right? And this is absolutely sensational.
Absolutely, yeah. I know some takes online said that, they may have also said this as a way to critique Biden as well ahead of the upcoming elections.
Of course, they're going to do that.
So I really wanted to do media critique on, the Canadian press's and Montreal press's take on this, since there was so much coverage in the States as well as internationally. And, since these headlines didn't really identify what he was doing, why he was doing it. But I can't really do that for you today because I only have one source.
So there hasn't been too much coverage on it?
Not too much. I think I was at least expecting maybe something in the National Post, but we can pull up the CBC article that I did find. U.S. airman who set himself on fire outside Israeli embassy in apparent act of protest has died. Underneath Aaron Bushnell, 25, an active duty member of the Air Force, was confirmed to have died. So CBC News.
This is just a repost from Reuters as well.
Exactly.
It's not like any kind of original analysis. They're just picking this up from The Wire.
Yeah. So I mean, pretty much the same as the U.S. coverage. They use the word protest. I think that is good.
Sure.
They did use the word Israeli embassy, so they state where.
Apparent act of protest, I guess, is
yeah.
interesting choice of words.
Yeah, that is an interesting choice of words. No mention of Palestine or Gaza in the title or subtitle. And, we are kind of in this generation or age of, quick flow of information. People aren't always going to go in and read the article.
Mm-hmm.
So if I were to just scroll by, that's a pretty intense title. I would want to read that.
Mm-hmm.
Hopefully others would, but...
There's not much analysis in this. There's not much placing this in a broader context.
No, not really. And I think it is so important to, as you said earlier, his last words were "Free Palestine."
Mm-hmm.
I think that's such an important thing to note, and it's, it's not even in the title.
There's also this is the second person who has self-immolated in the U.S. There was a woman, I believe 2 months ago. Carol. Apologies, I can't remember her name, but this was her case did not receive as far as much media attention as Aaron's did, and even then, you can see in Canadian media, it barely received anything.
Mm-hmm. Okay, interesting. Do you think with him he received more attention because he was in the Air Force?
I think being in the Air Force would do it. I think she, from what I don't quote me on this. As far as I know, her case was like it happened in Atlanta sometime. Yeah, if you want to look that up and confirm, I think it happened in Atlanta. Like a month, 2 months prior to Aaron's. Yeah.
Okay, interesting.
Yeah, Carol. As far from what I remember, if you write Atlanta self-immolation, it should come up. But I do believe Aaron being actively serving in the U.S. Air Force, I believe.
Yeah, he was. I have his title. Where is it? Or maybe I didn't write it down. No, I need to look it up.
That's all right. Anyways, I was saying, I think him being an active duty member of the Air Force absolutely is one of the reasons this is so widely covered. I think there's an interesting conversation I was having with a friend about how, especially in a place like America, like veterans, people who are active military servicemen are sort of like well regarded, at least in like a cultural way, where people kind of like, you salute them, they're kind of like representatives of this like supposedly great American institution, and for one to actively set himself on fire in protest against what his institution is doing, I think is something that really like it hits like this like resonant chord in everyone, where there's this like, oh my god, like this is someone who's supposed to be like, this person is supposed to be a whatever in all kind of American imaginations, a sort of role model, and here he is standing against what his institution is sort of like doing, right? I think it's there's a level of dissonance that I think it creates in a lot of people's minds and imaginations of what a U.S. Air Forceman is supposed to do. Usually they're supposed to be, I guess, in some ways like proud of serving. They're supposed to be happy towards serving these American interests. And here you have one who's like with an incredibly loud and defiant act saying like, no, I don't want to be a part of this.
So I found that in a statement on Monday, the Air Force stated that he was a cyber defense operations specialist with the 531st Intelligence Support Squadron. I was trying to search for, earlier today, his role specifically, how that could be involved in Gaza, or how this could be involved in American interference with foreign affairs in war of any kind. I don't quite know the details on this, but I think even if we don't know the details, like any form of being involved, cyber defense operations specialist,
sure.
Any form of being involved in the Air Force or the military, it does. You are a part of American imperialism.
Sure.
concerning-
I think his role would have been in the sort of like information technology kind of like their system that they use, and he was saying I think it was in some boards online that he was saying that he was sort of came across some classified information about how he had proof Americans were actually fighting in the tunnels in Gaza or something like that. Or this is his claim. I don't. It has, so far as from what I've read, it has not been like verified. But his claim was that he had read information about how America is actively in Gaza right now, and that's sort of like on the hush.
Interesting.
One of the things I saw was this loadout of like this. Was this like shipping papers he got? Not quite shipping papers. There's an actual more specific term for it. But he was about to be sent out to Gaza or something like that. It was one of the things I saw as well.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I'm interested to see in the coming weeks, what else comes out. I'm sure we're going to learn more.
I think to talk about the media, I guess analysis of this. I know Time Magazine in their kind of article about Bushnell's self-immolation, they gave a lot of space to the U.S. military and Air Force to kind of like give comment on this, which I know some people were kind of upset about giving them like platforming them, but I do think it's kind of like, I do think this is significant for one of their kind of and he's not just like a grunt either. He's not just like private like standing army. He's like actual like a specialist. For him to be setting himself on fire in his military fatigues, I think was something that like struck a chord with the military person who commented for Time Magazine. They were saying like, I think they had to reiterate, they're like, we do not want our servicemen engaging in any kind of act of protest while wearing standard issue uniforms, because it would like, we don't want people thinking that they sort of represent or they're sort of making public appearances on duty or like through as like a member of the U.S. Air Force or military or whatever. I think it's interesting to have them almost like scrambling, I guess, to try and like do damage control over this, because naturally this kind of puts a stake through the heart of like a lot of like what people's imagination of the U.S. military is, and the thing for him to do it in his fatigues as well is I think a huge sign that has bothered the higher ups in the American military.
Absolutely. Yeah, I've seen some really powerful pieces of art online, of him in his uniform and on fire, as well as for those who didn't watch the video or hear any kind of recap of it, essentially, after he had self-immolated, there were kind of calls off camera. Someone came to the scene. There was someone saying, sir, what are you doing?" as he was trying to flick the lighter. And then essentially you do see someone come on camera. And the video after Bushnell set himself on fire, the video that I watched was blurred. So I can't see exactly what the person who was trying to provide aid was doing, but you do see right after they the person who was trying to help him came on camera and then was kind of blurred. You see an officer approach and they're pointing a gun at Bushnell, and the person who's trying to provide support or get someone to do something, he's saying like, essentially, why are you pointing a gun?
Yeah, I think he said, I don't need a gun, I need a fire extinguisher.
Exactly.
I think it wasn't a police officer from what I read. I think it's one of the embassy security people.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. Yeah. You found...
Yeah, I found a little information about the... no name, unfortunately.
Yeah, and the ones I found, no name either.
Yeah, so this is the protests, the self-immolation in Atlanta happened December 2nd, 2023, so just very, very recently. Protesters in critical condition Friday after setting themselves on fire outside the Israeli consulate in Atlanta. Authorities said a security guard who tried to intervene was also injured. A Palestinian flag was found at the scene as part of the protests. Atlanta Police Chief Darren Shearbaum said at a news conference that the Palestinian flag was found. Yeah, he also added that investigators do not believe there's any connection to terrorism, and none of the consulate staff were ever in any danger. But I mean, I guess to talk about like the act of self-immolation, I think in the Tibetan context when it started this was like right after the Beijing 2008 Olympics. There was a massive protest, a widespread protest in Tibet in 2008. This was like across the plateau. Usually protests have been sort of isolated to the capital of the Tibetan Autonomous Region out in China's like sort of like western borderlands. It's like right next to like Nepal, India, and that area. Usually the protests have been sort of confined to there, and it's sort of like always like localized to a certain extent. In 2008, it was the first time that the protests were sort of like all across the plateau in like regions that didn't usually have these kinds of protests because for whatever reason there's enough like social welfare, there's enough kind of like appeasement, I guess, of the populace there. But 2008, it was like right after I think it was like talks with the Dalai Lama had kind of between the Dalai Lama and the Chinese government fell through. And then the act of bringing the Olympic torch through Tibetan areas and other kind of economic factors as well sort of brought the sort of population there into like really like intense unrest. I believe in Lhasa, the capital city, 2 Chinese people were killed, 2 Chinese shop workers were killed because I think on some level they were seen as sort of like settlers. They're sort of seen as outsiders who are sort of like encroaching on Tibetan territories. After that, huge levels of repression, crackdown. People were being like arrested en masse. People were sort of being put into prison, obviously, for these acts and being connected to these acts, talking about these acts. And the next, like, obviously, like even now, like from then till now, it's been a period of incredible securitization. So that's to say that the surveillance there is increased by a lot. A lot of the surveillance technology they use comes from Israel, so they're on that level they share, I guess, same tactics of like surveillance on like populations. A lot of the technology China uses they share with Israel or vice versa, and so this kind of and there's also a lot more checkpoints as well. So movement is also kind of affected as well. So it's not like you have a free flowing population that can go wherever they want. These have sort of contributed to a state of affairs where people have this desire to protest, to speak against what's sort of happening. And the method that has been sort of chosen by 160 Tibetans in Tibet was self-immolation between 2008 and 2000 and just maybe 2 years ago, a year and a half ago was the last one. That has been the main kind of form of protest for most of Tibetans. And I guess to say why that would be chosen, if you look at the context that I just gave, it's sort of like you don't have other means of protesting. You feel like you're kind of against this gigantic wall, this gigantic machine that's not really going to respond to your concerns or demands. And so you see that people turn to this as a sort of last ditch means of like getting the message out there, right? This is why I believe in Bushnell's case was a sort of similar thing, right? Where you think about how Bushnell, even though he's in the institution of the military, right? He's in the Air Force. He did not want to participate in the kind of ongoing genocide, and his choice of speaking out against it was self-immolation. Because I would say, if I look at the Tibetan cases, I'm inclined to believe that he didn't think that there was an actual kind of voice that would listen in the institution, the people guiding the ship, whether it's Biden, whether it's the Joint Chiefs of Staff, other generals. It's sort of, they're sort of deaf to the demands, right? I mean, as we've seen, like, I mean, maybe in places like Netherlands and Belgium, the government is more moral, or like they're listening to the population, they're listening to the UN. Where in the case of the US and even Canada to a certain extent, it's kind of like business as usual, and people aren't really listening to the demands of protesters. I will say they do listen. Like you do see some movement being gained and some kind of ground being gained. As you see some demands being kind of echoed at the higher echelons. In the case for Bushnell in the U.S., maybe he didn't believe that was possible, so he turned to self-immolation as a sort of incredibly drastic measure. I think that this also, I mean, the image like you're saying, right, is striking of this like man in his like military fatigues, sort of like completely on fire. To me, it kind of like recalls, and for a lot of people, it also recalls the image of I think Thich Quang Duc, the Vietnamese Buddhist monk who set himself on fire in opposition to the Diem regime in South Vietnam. A lot of people think it was opposition to the Vietnam War. It was technically before the war really started in proper. He was protesting the South Vietnamese government. It was a dictator installed by the U.S. He was protesting against the incredible sort of restrictions being placed on Buddhism and other kind of religious freedoms in South Vietnam, and so he burned himself alive. Some people might know the image from the Rage Against the Machine cover, which is, I mean, that's fine if you do know it from that. It's a striking image. Mm-hmm. It's a striking image, and it's this act of. I always think of it as an act of selflessness. Was for a lot of the Tibetans who have kind of self-immolated, any of the statements found they're kind of saying it's because some people try to paint Bushnell's things as just pure suicide. I know I used that word before, but I used it more in like a technical way. Some people have painted Bushnell's self-immolation as pure suicide, this man who is mentally unwell. Not to say that hasn't happened. In Montreal, even in the 70s, there's a Quebecois author, Huguette, I think, who set himself on fire in like the old port because he said the world beauty is being stolen, and then he set himself on fire in the old port. Not quite a political act like Bushnell's, still like an incredibly distressing, I guess, action to take from that. People say he was experienced a psychotic episode, which could very well be. I haven't dug into it too much, but I think to paint Bushnell's act as purely as a sort of result of like mental distress, not to say mental distress wasn't a part of it, to purely paint as a thing of mental health and to ignore the kind of political kind of tone to it, I think that does him a disservice, and also would do disservice to the Tibetans who have committed the same act. Although in the case of the Tibetans who have self-immolated, there have been a sort of a varying. I'm not going to pretend like they all did it for a singular reason. It's not like they were all sort of doing this against China. They're like some of them were doing this for like language rights. Some of them were doing this for so that His Holiness Dalai Lama could return to Tibet. Others were doing it for stronger Tibetan, the idea of a free Tibet as well. You'll always have different reasons. I think it's important to kind of not paint too broadly with one stroke, because I think you can have like with any kind of protest action, you can have different people with different intentions using that protest action. But I think it's important to at least somewhat acknowledge the political intentions behind it and not just paint it as a crisis of mental health.
If you can recall it, what do you think was the international or local reaction from media, after this was happening in Beijing?
In Tibet?
Sorry, in Tibet.
You got a lot of kind of reactions. I think from Western media, there's sort of like the classic, like, look, this is Tibetan, like Chinese people are treating Tibetans so badly that they're resorting to this, which is, I think colors it a little too lightly. I think there is something in. It is sort of it's also, I'm not going to pretend like it started in Tibet either, right? You had like, and it's not like Tibet has like a sort of like monopoly on this action, but it's just, to me, the closest experience I have to this kind of news. I think we also wanted to talk about, I think it was a Tunisian man who also self-immolated, and that was the sort of turning point for the Arab Spring when that started. But from media commentary, I know some people have treated it like, oh, maybe we should kind of consider this as like things of like suicide or mental health crises, and it's just, I don't know that that's the right angle to be looking at. Not that that shouldn't be considered, but I think for the most part, people I think gave it a lot more political consideration. But I do think that is because of the role China has in the Western imagination as the sort of like big antagonist. So anytime something comes up against them, people are sort of ready and willing to kind of consider them the antagonists and to consider these acts political, where when this happens in the States, maybe there's a bit of a question of whether or not it should be considered political, because the antagonist is not just the classic antagonist of China, but it's the U.S.
Interesting. Very interesting. Yeah, I have some details on what you brought up.
Please.
The merchant that you just mentioned, his name was Mohamed Bouazizi. He was a 26-year-old Tunisian fruit and vegetable vendor who set himself on fire in the town of Sidi Bouzid, which essentially triggered the Arab Spring. So on the morning of October 7th, 2010, police had confiscated his scales because he was working without a permit. So he then went to complain to the governor, and the governor essentially refused to see him. And in an act of sheer desperation of protest, Mohammed set himself on fire on the street outside of the building where the governor was located. I read this report. Essentially, it was a 10-year anniversary report on his death, where they had interviewed family members, most notably his brother Ali. And in a statement to Al Jazeera, his brother Ali said that Mohammed was always harassed by police for bribes since he worked...
I don't know where that came from. I'm sorry about that.
Since he worked without a permit, and as a result, they would confiscate his scales or his produce, and after Mohammed set himself on fire, essentially aid was provided. He was transferred for the hospital, but during people were gathering and they were protesting, and even after he left, a massive protest was formed outside of the building. Hundreds of people. Ali, his brother, had heard that someone had self-immolated and didn't actually know that it was his brother until he arrived.
That's tough.
But he went with his camera to film the event. Once he arrived, I'm not sure on the specific details if his brother had already, been rescued and transported. But I do know that he did start filming the protest. And essentially, he was weighing whether or not to post it on Facebook, as this was risky to criticize the Tunisian regime at the time. He could be imprisoned. Worse could happen. But essentially, in this anniversary post, Ali told Al Jazeera, "I felt I couldn't back down now. For the sake of my children and family, this was a God-given chance, and I had to take it." After he posted this protest on Facebook, TV stations picked it up locally as well as internationally. And less than a month later, the Tunisian regime fell, and then President Ben Ali fled the country. So essentially this act launched the Arab Spring, which was a series of anti-government protests, uprisings, and armed rebellion that spread across much of the Arab world. It was this one act, in pure desperation. I think I even have a screenshot I took, because I think there was a lot of question after, why did he do it? He seemed like such a happy person. Okay, so this is an excerpt from the Al Jazeera article. These are the words of Ali, his brother. "Let me tell you something I haven't told anyone yet. Our cousin Lassad, who controls the taxes in the market, told me later about a conversation he'd had with Mohammed a week before his self-immolation. I'm so fed up and tired, Mohammed said. I can't breathe anymore." So, I'm sure that... I think that it just, people are so desperate to survive, and obviously I can't know exactly what he was feeling in this moment, but I think when people do self-immolate, it's almost similar to Bushnell, of just like exhaustion with the system that we live in, and as you were saying before, recognition that politicians aren't going to change the status quo, and I really need to almost self-sacrifice myself because I can't continue living in this world.
It's like a refusal to kind of play the game, right? To kind of like I guess in his case, he's dealing with the bureaucracy of like Tunisian like food markets, right? And he's just like, this is so like, he, for whatever reason, he saw it kind of like continuing, and he's like, and he decided he did not want to take part in that. And besides just removing himself from like the game, he actually like turned into this act of protest.
Absolutely. And I think there's such a strong connection there with Bushnell and I was just about to say Mohammed, but Bouazizi, because Bouazizi was trying to speak with the governor, was refused. And I don't know if Bushnell took any acts to try and speak with someone, but we're seeing massive protests in the U.S. We're seeing people confront, even in Canada as well, confront local politicians. Even Justin Trudeau, people are confronting Joe Biden and asking, when is this going to stop? Why are we complicit in this? And, there's some sweet words. Some of them are ignoring the protesters, but it's just, similar to this government, like this governor in Tunisia at the time, like a refusal to almost engage, a refusal to change the status quo. And it's almost like we need such horrific images to try and like spark a conversation, because I think we're seeing such horrific images on an ongoing basis come out of Gaza that I think so many people have become kind of numb to it. It's, it's the status quo. And now we're seeing a horrific image of someone who set themselves on fire, just in country neighboring us. And I think that's kind of something that's really shocked us, and we're having kind of this different conversation now.
Even for me, I think it's like, even though I'm sort of, to whatever extent, used to the image of self-immolations, to me, it's still this thing I associate with either like the Buddhist world, like Tibet, Vietnam, Tunisia, which is not Buddhist, but like, there's like, to me, it still remains a thing of like this overseas phenomenon. And to see it sort of start happening here, I think it's like, it was incredibly shocking to me.
Yeah.
It was incredibly shocking to me to see these images that I associate with Tibet, I associate with Vietnam, Tunisia, to see that happening in the US, I think was shocking to me. I think it was surprising. As much as I want to say, as much as I think the rationale of it, now that we discuss it afterwards, about it being this act of sort of like whatever desperation, this person who felt like he did not want to participate in the sort of game of imperialism anymore, and he wanted to remove himself from it in a very like in a spectacular way, truly, like in terms of just like having this thing that he wants to send a message. He doesn't just want to resign. He wants his death to be a message. I think is incredibly shocking, striking.
Absolutely.
You know? And I think there is something I think about it. There's this line I think, and I never want to. As much as we discuss about what we imagine it's like to be in these scenarios, as much as we want to point out how I think it is this extraordinarily big decision that these people take doing these things. I do think I'm always on the like it's far from an endorsement of it, I want to say. I think I can never really fully endorse this kind of action. As much as it is extraordinary, as much as it does take whatever like careful consideration, as much as I can agree with the sort of intentions behind it, I can never truly endorse it, even in Tibetan cases, because I think whenever I think of like these actions, it is like a person, multiple people who don't feel like they have other avenues for dissent. It's people who feel like they no longer have the means to sort of air their grievances in a way that's going to be heard, received. And so they turn to this act, which I still think, as much as I use the word it's selfless, I think it's still an individualist act, right? Because it's only involves yourself. These people, there is, for whatever reasons, and there's no blame being put in this, but for whatever reasons, maybe even outside of their control, they didn't feel like they had a community that they could sort of mobilize. They didn't feel like they had neighbors, even though his family, Bouazizi's family, he had like apparently family in the government. Clearly, he didn't see that person as any kind of leveraging point. There's no kind of help he could get from there. And I do think these are kind of like acts that come from this place of estrangement, I guess, from a broader community or a broader collective that you can mobilize with. And that's, I think for that reason, I am never going to sort of, at least in these terms, endorse this kind of act. As much as we say it's brave, as much as we can agree with like the sort of politics of it, right? It's like, of course, absolutely free Palestine. But the last thing I want to see is more people doing this, right? Of course, if more people start doing this, and it's like we can always draw the rationale behind it, being like, of course, there's more and more people who are sort of fed up with the kind of U.S. institutions because they're not listening. But I'm never going to endorse it, because these are still individualist acts. These are still acts out of isolation. They're still acts that, as bright as they are, as much attention as they give, I think they don't really build power, which I think is important to kind of think about. And I think when I think about the Tibetan cases, I think it is a great loss, because these people turned their incredible passion for whatever their causes were into, and they effectively snuffed out their passion that they could have used to rile up any kind of support, any kind of base building, movement building, power building exercise. And of course, in the Tibetan case, there is such incredible surveillance. The ceiling is so low for anything like that. I mean, even the people who did self-immolate, their families were arrested, and because like they're trying to make it a thing where it was illegal to self-immolate. It's like, it's if your family is caught self-immolating and you were found in any way to have kind of like help it happen, to make it happen, then your family would be in trouble too. Which is like, to me, like absolutely. I mean, to me that it recalls the image of the Israeli embassy security guard sort of pointing the gun at the person on fire, right? Because it's like, if their life was the thing that they were concerned about, they wouldn't be doing this act, right? So it almost takes away the power of being able to point a gun at someone. Mm-hmm. It like, if the person on the other end is not in fear of their life, and so now the gun is useless, and you look like an idiot.
Yeah, very well said. Yeah, something I actually found surprising when I was, researching the history of self-immolation is, where it was used, and I think you did a great job of discussing, this use in Tibet and Vietnam as well. There was a few cases in Iran after the revolution, as well as in Russia, in India for centuries too. And there have been over the last few decades a few, like very, very small, but a few cases in the U.S. And I believe every case except one I read, I think it was around 5, were in protest of, U.S.-led wars or, involvement, imperialist involvement by the U.S. and other countries. So that was kind of interesting to, see that trend, that self-immolation, when it is used in the U.S., although very few circumstances have happened, they've all been linked to protesting U.S.-led wars, U.S.-involved, the U.S. wars that are also involved, the U.S. is involved in. Sorry.
Sure, no, I understood.
Yeah. I think that's all I really have to say, but I think I'm still kind of digesting this, and there's so much more I want to read, and I think so much I'll probably have to say in the future, but I'm astonished.
No, I think astonished is the right word. I'm curious to see how this development will continue. Very curious how the branches of the U.S. Military will be adjusting to this, because I can guarantee right now in different branches of the U.S. military, the Navy, the U.S. Army, Marines, Air Force, there's meetings happening about this. There's lots of people probably talking about like, how do we prevent this? What does this mean for us? And there's going to be changes that are going to be put into place for this. Probably maybe in Canadian military as well. Who knows?
Yeah, very interesting. Yeah, well, I guess let me know if you see anything. I'll let you know if I see any reports from Canadian media outside the CBC article.
And we'll bring them back on Hello Good Bylines.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for coming on, Savanna. That's it for today's show, folks. Thank you for tuning in, listening, supporting our show. If you like what you saw, give it a like, a comment, tell your friends about it, tell your coworkers about it, tell some random person on the street about it. That's all the promotion I have right now.